Can you admit just me?
Yeah. Okay. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you're dialing in from. Thank you for joining today's European Biosafety Network webinar. My name is Josh Cobb. I'm the current secretary of the EBN. Over the next hour of this webinar, we will be examining the occupational risks of formaldehyde exposure in healthcare and the practical steps organizations can take to protect their workforce. This is a webinar hosted by the European Biosafety Network, and this session will bring together regulatory expertise and international occupational health insights from some experts to examine the hazards facing healthcare workers who handle formalin and formaldehyde, the legal obligations placed on employers to protect them, and the changes that we need to see to make safer practice a reality. This session is intended for all healthcare workers. However, it's particularly pertinent for laboratory managers, theatre leads, occupational health teams, safety leads, and policymakers with an interest in protecting healthcare workers from formaldehyde exposure. Before we begin, a quick word on housekeeping. I'm about to introduce our first speaker, who will present for approximately 20 minutes. Then we'll have time for a short Q&A. So please, if you could put all of your messages in the chat. Then I will present our recent white paper findings for another 20 minutes or so before a final Q&A at the end. The total webinar will be about an hour and we will finish on the hour. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Or alternatively, you can email my colleague Ella, who is about to put her email address in the chat as well. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Acran Selman Navarro. He is an occupational physician specialized in population and global health. He is the chair of the ICOH Scientific Committee on Occupational Health for Health Workers. Dr. Acran, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you very much to the European Biosafety Network and everybody here in this call. I am pleased to be here and to speak about a little bit of how can we prevent occupational diseases and injuries caused by the exposure of specifically formaldehyde. I will share my screen right now. All right, so I'm assuming everybody sees the slides. So my name is Acran Selman Navarro. I'm here in representation of the ICOH. ICOH is the International Commission of Occupational Health. We have 32 scientific committees, and I chair the Occupational Health for Health Workers. I'm an occupational physician. I specialize in population health and global health, specifically in prevention of occupational diseases and injuries. I declare no conflict of interest in this presentation, and I first wanted to open up the presentation on talking about what is a health worker and what is the vulnerability and why is this important. Well, we at the Occupational Health Scientific Committee for Health Workers at ICOH acknowledge the fact that there's approximately 58 million, 60 million health workers around the world. Around 2/3 of them provide health service, but the other 1/3 do not do direct patient care. More of a supportive, but they're part of a whole health system. And also acknowledge that women comprise nearly 80% of the health workforce globally, which is pretty significant, and we create and adapt prevention strategies also with a gender perspective. There's a global shortage of health workers that increases the possibilities of human error, increases the possibility of increases the risk of exposures of all types. And that is something that we always look at and is very important when we talk about prevention, specifically due to the shortage of health workers, specifically in low and middle income countries. It is very important to acknowledge that, as I mentioned before, that health workers, healthcare is a system, and not just those who do patient care. And we have to create preventive programs that englobes everybody within the health system. We're going to talk about formaldehyde today. So, what is formaldehyde? Formaldehyde is a CH2O. The simplest aldehyde. It's a structure built around a carbon atom, double bonded to oxygen, and single bonded into hydrogens. Why does this matter? Well, it's highly reactive. It's used in resins, plastics, chemicals, and chemical synthesis. It's biologically relevant because, it's also produced in small amounts. We're going to speak about it in the next slide within our human body metabolism. Regularizes hazards. We need to regulate its hazard because it's highly reactive. It also means can irritate tissues, requires strict occupational exposure limits. More macroscopically, it's a colorless, strong smelling chemical that is a gas at room temperature. It actually occurs naturally in the environment. Believe it or not, it's included in some foods in small amounts. And even inside our bodies because we metabolize it, and it stays in our body. It's a chemical widely used in industry. For example, in the pressed wood products, plywood, in glues, adhesives, permanent press fabrics, papers, you name it. It's basically, in a lot of places that we don't even know it exists. Usually in small amounts, and non-toxic amounts, but in many cases, in amounts that are hazardous to human health. When it is dissolved in water, we call it formalin. So that's what we're going to speak about it now in healthcare. Why is it called formalin? And it's used for disinfection, funeral homes, and in medical labs and in medical healthcare settings, as this presentation brings us together today. And while formalin is found naturally in small amounts in some foods, including fruits, it can also be, it can also be added in some preservatives and so forth. And in fact, it can be also produced in the result of cooking and smoking on small amounts as well. Now, in healthcare settings, we use what we call the NBF, which is the 10% natural buffer formalin. There's a preparation overview that I'm gonna go quickly through this, but you're gonna understand why it's important to know this part of the process. The formalin, it comes formaldehyde comes in a diluted 37 to 40% formalin, and then we dilute it in a 1.9 ratio, and then we use it as a 4% formaldehyde, right? So buffer in 7 to 7.4%. The penetration hour is 0.5 to 1 millimeter per hour. This is relevant, when you use the specimen to fix it, and so you don't ruin it. We're going to talk about it later. Fixation time, when you use it to fixate tissues, is from 6 to 48 hours. And it requires, around 10 to 20% more of the tissue volume in order for proper fixation. So it's a very specific preparation that it has a very specific result on what we're trying to fixate, on the fixation of the specimen that we're trying to preserve, but also has a very specific effect on the human body, which is particularly hazardous. This preparation is used, for routine histology, for hematoxylin and eosine staining, in the histologic process, for immunohistochemistry, preventing autolysis of microbial degradation, long-term archival preservation, and so forth. What is the preparation used for? Well, like we said, like we mentioned, histopathological laboratories, cancer centers, research labs for biopsies, resections, intraoperatives, specimens, and so forth. For cell blocking, long-term preservation needed, and also storing paraffin in blocks for years and maybe decades. So it's a very effective an efficient way of preserving tissue, on preserving what we want to preserve, specifically tissues that we want to, study afterwards or look at afterwards. Um, so in healthcare practice, oh sorry, uh, so the health effects of this very specific, very well prepared, and very efficient and effective chemical and process has a particular health effect in humans, and it has acute effects and it has chronic effects. We're going to start with acute effects. When you have exposure to these fumes, exposure to these gases, it's very common to have eye and nose irritation and throat irritation. So you inhale it, and then it irritates your tissues and your nose and your throats, because of because of the molecular component that we spoke earlier. It's very reactive and it's very binding. Of course, when you keep breathing and it goes down your lungs and your airways, it can cause coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, and in many cases, we as occupational physicians have encountered cases where you have workers who have non-occupational asthma, for example, or they've had asthma when they were kids or many, many years ago, and it can cause chemical-induced asthma. So that's what we call an occupational disease that was a common disease aggravated by work. So you have a common disease, you were asthmatic, for many years, you've never had a crisis, and all of a sudden you're exposed to these fumes, and then you have a crisis of asthma at that point. And that's where you call it, aggravated or exacerbated by the exposure. I mean, it's broader than this, but I'm just giving you a few examples, of the acute effect. Also, it's very well known and very well documented that it causes skin irritation when it touches your skin, and so it can cause, allergic dermatitis, among others. And the same principle of aggravation and exacerbation plays here. I mean, if you're a person who has eczema, or you're an you have an atopic gene, and you have an atopic skin, so this just exacerbates it. But if you're not, it can cause it even if you don't have a common disease. Chronically, you can have occupational asthma, reduced lung function, histopathologic changes of your nasal mucosa when you have constant exposure to it. And one of the things that concerns us the most, and why basically we're here today, is that is a carcinogenic. So it's an IARC. The International Agency for Research and Cancer has categorized it as a carcinogenic. And it can cause, nasopharyngeal cancer, sinosal cancer, and unfortunately also myeloid leukemia. There's been some cases that are being studied in animal laboratories and all of that. And it does cause, for chronic exposure, it does have a DNA and effect, so they can cause, carcinogenic effects. Clinical context, it's during biopsies, fixation procedures. Staff may be exposed when opening containers, pouring formalin, and handling inaccurate specimens. So, like I said, it's a group 1 carcinogenic to humans. It's in the same groups as UV light, tobacco, radiation, and so forth. Health risks during clinical fixation and workflows. All right, so do we have a workflows when we're in the lab, right? So, for example, you have exposure to pathways and tasks. You open handling, you open a specimen jar, you pure fixative, and decanting the gross room, releasing vapors at face level, for example, right? It can also be the exposure can be also happening on the transfer steps, moving one tissue between a cassette or container, tapping the fixative, and bulking it. Or you can have the exposure in the post procedure, decontaminating surfaces, managing spills, and so forth. So you can have exposures in the actual handling, in the transferring, and in the post procedure. And like I said, these effects are going to depend if they're chronic or they're acute, depending on how often you're exposed, the time that you're exposed, the time that their exposure lasts, and depending on how preventive programs are all in place. There are special populations that we always look at. I mean, everybody, of course, is important, and all workers and prevention have to cover 100% of the populations. But it is very important to have controls with pregnant workers, for example, individuals who have asthma, like I spoke earlier, in individuals with skin atopy, and so forth. So when we do preventive programs, we don't only control the source and the exposure per se, but we also control the population organizationally. We rotate people, we minimize the exposure and the handling if these people are prone to more exacerbation or aggravation, or even endangering the pregnancy of a female worker. There are exposure limits around the world, and that this is very, very important. But some of them are more lenient, some of them are moderate, some of them are stricter. But it's important to understand, all these health effects, and there are very important preventive exposure recommendations in place around the world. So for example, if you have a time weighted average of 8 hours, it's the amount of formaldehyde a worker can be exposed over a full workday, for example. The lower the number, the stricter the protection, which is the 8-hour TWA. Or you have the short-term ceiling also, short-term ceilings, is the maximum allowed exposure during a short bust. Usually 15 minutes, it's the literature says, So it's an instantaneous ceiling that must be never exceeded, of course, the lower the number, the stricter the protection. And there are all regulatory instruments around the world also, many countries have the primary legislative instrument, which covers all workers. But there are also very specific pertaining to formaldehyde. I can share the slides. I'm not going to go over everything in detail. But the point here of these couple of slides is to understand that there are legislations and there are regulations in place. Some of them are more lenient, some of them are moderate, some of them are stricter, but they are there. They exist, and we should look at them and legislative wise. But primarily understanding the health effects that this has to workers around healthcare systems, and understanding why it is important to create preventive programs beyond the legislations. I mean, legislations are a result of advocacy and science and academia. But we can always do better than legislation. Understanding the exposure, understanding the parameters and the health effects. As an occupational physician, it is very important to understand that this is the preventive discipline. We in occupational health, I'm particularly a physician, but within the realm of occupational health, you can have industrial hygienists, ergonomists, physicians, psychologists. I mean, you name it. It's multidisciplinary, right? So we as physicians, we look at the person, but we also look at the workplace. So we see the workplace as a patient, and we see the patient as a patient, right? We see the worker as a worker. In other words, if a worker comes in my consultation, knocks on the door and says, "Hey, listen, I have work-induced asthma due to formalin exposure," then I will treat the patient. But that is half of the job done. I also have to go and treat my second patient, which is the workplace. That's why we talk about population health, right? We go and do prevention on a population that's exposed, not only one person. Um, because that person that came into my console this morning may move to another job, but then there's 100 people rotating in the same workplace. So we look to do prevention depending on where we at, right? Ideally, we should do primary prevention. Primary prevention, I mean, you have a well population and you want to do you want to enclose an exposure and basically eliminate it altogether, so people are not being exposed, thus not get sick. We can also do secondary prevention. I mean, people are being exposed already. It's unfortunate, but we can do prevention as well. We can screen the risk, we can do control, and we can do early interventions. And unfortunately, most of the things that we end up doing is tertiary prevention. It's kind of like rehabilitation, trying to identify who are the people who are sick, exposed, minimize their health risk, and then also do workplace prevention. So we want to make it as primary as possible. But of course, if we do a lot of tertiary prevention, and which is part of the whole formula of the discipline of doing occupational health. And with that being said, when we want to do prevention and we want to understand, if we want to do primary, secondary, or tertiary, it depends on what we're looking at. It depends what the exposure is. Depends what the chemical, the biomechanical exposure, whatever we're trying to prevent. In this case, we're talking about a biohazard, which is formalin, right? So we usually use the famous hierarchy of control inverse pyramid. But we do preventions through design. So we try to design in a way that prevention can be as best as possible. The first thing that we do everybody does, as a reaction is, we give workers personal protective equipment, which is fine, right? But you're not eliminating the actual source of the exposure. You're just creating a barrier, which is recommended, but you're not really doing primary prevention. So then, we can do administrative controls, rotating folks, workers around the exposure, like we spoke about, high risk workers like pregnant, like asthmatic, and all of this. So, you can do work behaviors, you could do training, you can do engineering controls, like isolating the exposure. You can substitute what you're trying to minimize the exposure. Sometimes it's possible to substitute, sometimes it's not, right? For example, if you are in a steel industry and you work in 600 Fahrenheit, you can't, there's no way to substitute the exposure of heat. It's just the way it is. So you try to work around it and do engineering controls. In the case of formalin, for example, there are some initiatives of substitutions, but as of now, it's the chemical that is widely used around the world. So we try to eliminate. How do you eliminate? Do you completely substitute? So it's a combination of you try to do a combination of elimination, substituting, and use systems that minimize the exposure as much as possible. All right. So you understand the process, you assess the risk, and you do prevention through design. There's many ways to prevent the exposure, or there are a combination of ways. You can do ventilation with closed system with rotations and so forth. So the whole point of my presentation here is to understand, what are the health effects to the workers. Why is this important? Why does it have a specific effect to the workers? Because it needs a specific preparation for a specific objective chemically, right? For the specimens. And of course, we want to do preventions as primary as possible, and that's what we're here for. Okay, so well, I thank you. I'm going to stop there, and then I'll hand it to Josh for the moderating.
Thank you, Akran. And thank you for a very interesting presentation. Before we move on to my presentation, which is about our EBM white paper, if anyone has any questions for Dr. Akran, please put them in the chat. There's one question there from someone called Bart who's asking about whether there's any countries in which asthma in healthcare workers working with formalin is considered a recognized work-related issue for insurance purposes. In my experience in the UK, you can claim for work-related asthma to get some level of compensation. I also believe that that's the same in some EU countries. But Dr. Akran, you might know more about the US or globally.
Well, it's a very interesting question because it's something that we struggle a lot globally all the time. But I guess my answer to that question would be most countries have recognized as occupational asthma what we call chemical induced asthma, right? So it actually englobes many other substances aside from formalin. So it will depend, on each country. We would have to do a little bit of a literature review and on how that can entail. But if a country doesn't have regulations specifically on formalin, I'm sure they have some type of chemical induced asthma that can be, easily compensated if diagnosed as work related.
Thank you. And I do encourage anyone else to put questions in the chat for myself and Akran, and we will answer them after we finish my presentation. So thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. That working?
Yes.
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 Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for listening to the first section of that presentation. Over the next 20 minutes, my presentation will take you mainly through the findings of a recent white paper that we've produced as the European Biosafety Network. We published it in April 2026. It's titled Formalin, Formaldehyde in Healthcare, Occupational Risks, Regulatory Obligations and Closed System Solutions. For all transparency, the research behind this white paper was funded by AXLab. Its contents, however, were produced independently and have been subject to independent academic review. The findings I'm about to share are the European Biosafety Networks. What I want you all to take away from today is quite simple, which is that formalin formaldehyde as a product is not going away. It will remain the gold standard for preserving tissue samples that drive diagnostic pathology, but the way in which we handle them in healthcare settings today is exposing workers to a known carcinogen. A lot of laws already require us to do something about this, and there is technology that already exists to protect healthcare workers, but we need to do so today. A quick note about the EBN. The EBN is a pan-European coalition dedicated to advancing biological, occupational, and patient safety in the health and care sectors. Established in 2010, the network's grown from its founding members, which were Unison and the Spanish General Council of Nursing, to now include a wide alliance of national and European professional bodies, healthcare unions, institutions, clinicians, researchers, safety technology experts, and other stakeholders who are committed to protecting healthcare workers and patients alike. We work closely with ministries of health, labour and employment, with EU institutions such as the Commission, EU OSHA and EU Parliament, and with other healthcare employers, pharmacy organisation, nursing representation, academic institutions, civil society and industry. We regularly host summits in person and online, technical workshops, roundtables. We produce guidance, white papers, reports, and we try to coordinate multiple stakeholders in awareness campaigns, all aimed at reducing risks to workers and promoting safety innovation across healthcare settings. Here we are in Parliament recently, in EU Parliament, giving evidence at a committee hearing on exposure to hazardous drugs. Now onto the white paper. So formalin formaldehyde is an incredibly interesting topic. There's so much wide-ranging research available online about the topic. But when we went to kind of evaluate it, we realized that there wasn't quite a centralization on all of the available research. And I hope that that's what this white paper has achieved. Please scan the QR code to download it. I'll leave it on the slide for one more second. The white paper is fully referenced and structured, and the main points I'll cover are the role of formalin in healthcare, the occupational risks, the regulatory landscape, and then the evidence based for the use of closed systems and containing exposure at source. So let's start with the problem. So I won't go over this too much as Acran did in his previous presentation, but we know that formalin is a colorless volatile gas. In healthcare, we use it as formalin, an aqueous solution of formaldehyde, typically diluted to around 4% for tissue fixation. That's the formulation that most people on this call will know as 10% neutral buffered formalin. Formalin works because it binds to proteins inside tissue and locks the structure in place. It is the gold standard fixative. It's used every day in operating theatres, endoscopy units, pathology laboratories, and other healthcare settings across Europe by thousands of healthcare workers. It's very clear that formalin as a substance is not going away. Decades of research have failed to produce any alternative that matches its performance, its cost, and its compatibility with workflows. So when we talk about the risks today, we're not trying to replace formalin, we're talking about how we can contain that risk. It's the very property that makes formalin so useful, which is its reactivity with proteins, that also makes it dangerous to the people handling it, which Dr. Acran covered very concisely. Formaldehyde, as we know, is a category 1B carcinogen under EU and UK law. It's an indispensable solution, but it's also hazardous. So who is at risk? Any healthcare setting that uses formalin or formaldehyde using open containers, any worker or person within that space is at risk of exposure. However, in our research for the white paper, we identified 6 groups of healthcare workers in particular. First was operating theatre nurses who handle specimens at the point of collection. They're often opening pre-filled containers in environments that are designed for surgery, not for chemical handling, such as a isolator in a pharmacy. Pathology technicians who are doing the tissue grossing, the manual cutting up, inspection of the specimen, which is constantly identified as the highest exposure task across most of the literature we explored. Laboratory staff who are often receiving, logging, and processing specimens. Endoscopy nurses who have to handle biopsy samples while they're being transferred into the pots. And then not to be overlooked is domestic and cleaning staff or ancillary workers who can spend many hours in a week cleaning anatomy labs, and often with the least amount of protection or PPE. So these are the people who we identified most at risk, but they're not the only people, and it's very important to be aware that any healthcare setting where you have open containers, people are at risk. So looking at the scale of the exposure, in a typical indoor environment, which is your home or your office, background formaldehyde levels sit somewhere between 200ths and 0.4 of 1 part per million. WHO's indoor air quality guidance is set at 0.08 parts per million. In a pathology laboratory, however, during routine tissue handling, exposures of up to 0.66 parts per million have been measured. That's up to 33 times the typical indoor level, and it's roughly eight times what the WHO indoor air quality guideline sets. It's also more than double the European Union's occupational exposure limit for an 8-hour day. So when we describe workplaces as exposed, we're really not exaggerating. We're describing routine daily exposure to concentrations that the WHO considers unacceptable. A recent Channel 4 documentary, which gained a lot of attention in the UK, they had spoken to several lab staff who had developed lots of consequences of handling formaldehyde, including asthma. Other doctors described vomiting and nosebleeds and chronic fatigue. There was a histopathologist and an academic. They collected data using FOI requests to over 100 NHS pathology departments. And they found that over a third of those departments exceeded the UK's legal threshold at least once last year. Some were up to 70 times over the legal threshold. So what does exposure actually do to people? In the short term, it can cause symptoms most healthcare workers on this call would recognize, things like eye irritation, watery eyes, a sore throat, scratchy throat, coughing, headaches, skin redness. In one well-documented hospital study, which is referenced on the screen, of histopathology lab workers reported formaldehyde-related symptoms, 51% of the lab workers recorded symptoms compared to 35% of unexposed colleagues working in the same building. These symptoms that I mentioned are often dismissed as a normal part of the job. They should not be. They are clear markers of biological damage, and over time they can progress into more serious consequences. In longer term, we see things like allergic rhinitis, we see occupational asthma, we see sensitization, so workers becoming progressively more reactive each time they get re-exposed. There's a lot of contact dermatitis that does not respond to changing types of gloves, because the problem is chemical. And on the most serious end of the spectrum, and something I'll talk about more in a minute, is cancers of the upper respiratory tract. So this is not hypothetical risk, it's very well documented occupational disease profile of working with formalin. Onto the part where we have our more expertise is the regulatory position. So this is what European and UK law actually requires. So the legal framework in the European Union, formaldehyde is regulated under the CMRD, which is the Carcinogenic, Mutagenic, Reprotoxic Substances Directive. It was updated in 2022. About 2 weeks ago, they voted on a few amendments. So we'll have CMRD 6 coming out probably at the end of this year. Under that directive, formalin is classified as a Cat 1b carcinogen with an occupational exposure limit of 0.3 parts per million averaged out over an 8-hour day. And also 0.6 parts per million over any 15-minute period. Annex 3 of this directive requires the use of closed systems wherever the nature of work allows it, and medical surveillance for exposed workers is mandatory. Then in the UK, formaldehyde exposure is regulated through COSHH, which is the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health regulation. After Brexit, the UK retained the same Cat 1b classification of the carcinogen, and it imposes equivalent duties on UK employers. The hierarchy of controls, which Acran showed, is legally mandated. So employers must demonstrate that they have pursued elimination at source and that engineering controls have been considered before they rely on PPE. As we know, elimination and substitution aren't viable for formalin, so you have to look at engineering controls before you look at PPE. The principle is the same in the UK and the EU, where the burden sits with the employer, not the worker, to eliminate exposure at source. I won't stick too long on this slide because Dr. Acran has covered it. However, the important thing here is that elimination is not possible, substitution is not possible, so you must consider engineering controls. And this is where our white paper went on to about the closed systems. This is where you must act before you look at training protocols or workflows and PPE. If possible, you must stop exposure at source. And PPE is at the bottom of the pyramid for a reason, which is that surgical masks, nitrile gloves are not certified to protect against volatile gas. Reliance on PPE can often create a false sense of security. In some cases, it might actually increase exposure because workers believe they're adequately protected when they're not. The legal point about this slide is that under both the CMRD in Europe and COSHH in the UK, PPE alone is not sufficient where a closed system alternative is feasible. So looking at the compliance gap, and here is where the law and the reality diverge. The law requires closed systems where feasible, medical surveillance, the hierarchy of controls prioritized, where engineering controls are prioritized over PPE. But what still happens in many facilities in the UK and across Europe is that open containers are in routine use. Staff are relying on gloves and masks alone. There's no systemic reporting or monitoring. Workers are experiencing symptoms and in many cases not reporting them to their seniors because symptoms have become the normal part. They become a normal background of the job. In one Iranian hospital study, which I've put on the screen there, more than 91% of pathology lab workers were exposed above safety limits. That's not a marginal compliance issue, it's a workforce issue. There's an implementation gap between what the CMRD says and at a European level and is transposed into national law. And there are also gaps in the COSHH regulation in the UK where employers can find gaps such as the ALOP principle, whereby exposure should be limited to levels as low as reasonably practicable, which means that factors such as cost or resource training capacity can be used as excuses to not provide adequate protections for healthcare workers. To talk about the cancer risk, formaldehyde, as I mentioned, is classified as a category 1B carcinogen. That's by the EU CLP regulation and in the UK by the HSE. That's a regulatory category for substances that should be assumed to cause cancer in humans. The strongest and most reproducible evidence relates to cancers of the nasopharynx and the nasal cavities. These are the tissues that come into contact with inhaled formaldehyde. There's also evidence of genotoxic mechanisms, things like DNA damage, chromosomal alterations, and protein adducts in the cell lining in the upper airway. On this slide as well, I just wanted to flag another story in the news. I mentioned the Channel 4 one in the UK. There was recently a Danish documentary broadcast in February, which reported that 4 former student instructors at a university in Copenhagen working in their anatomy department, all of them had been exposed to formalin in dissection labs. And all 4 of them had developed cancer quite young, and 3 of them sadly passed away. The documentary did not conclude causation, but it raised serious questions about long-term occupational exposure in teaching settings, and I know that it made quite a stir in Denmark. So to talk about an important part of this story, which is that you have health effects at low dosage. Adverse health effects are observed even when measured exposures fall within the regulatory limits. So workers are getting sick at exposure levels that are technically compliant. So a few studies here that we looked at for our report. A 2025 study in Taiwan looked at 414 healthcare workers exposed to formalin at concentrations all below 10% of the permissible exposure limit. Even at those low levels, exposed workers were significantly more likely to experience skin irritation, eye and throat irritation, allergic rhinitis, and allergic dermatitis, roughly 17 times higher for allergic rhinitis. Another study out of North Borneo found that 51% of exposed histopathology workers reported formaldehyde-related symptoms, and there's multiple Malaysian hospital studies as well. The implications are unavoidable. Compliance with threshold values does not equate protection, and the limits themselves may simply be insufficient. So looking at the solution, what does work? And this is where we look at containment at source. Closed system specimen containers are the engineering control that the regulatory framework points us towards and which the evidence base supports. The idea is quite simple. A specimen is placed inside a container, the lid is then secured on top, and only then, once it's closed, is the formalin released, typically from a sealed reservoir within the lid itself. The release happens when the container is closed, which means that there is no open air exposure at the point of specimen collection. That sealed container that can then be transported and stored without vapor release, leakage, or spillage. Crucially, these systems don't require specialist training. They do not require change in workflows. They integrate with existing workflows. Another study here, which was 20 years long, and it was the most detailed published example of the use of monitoring for these systems. Implementation of closed circuit containers reduced airborne formaldehyde concentrations by more than 90%. There was a 93% decrease in time-weighted and short-term exposures in the gross room, which is the room where the highest exposures occur. And there was an 87% decrease at specimen reception and in operating theatres. Not all closed systems are equal, and this is an overview of what to look for when choosing whichever product you decide to use. This is a product neutral presentation. There's 6 criteria which we recommend looking for. First is integrity of the seal, which is basically integrity of how closed the system is. This is where the lid would engage with the container wall. Secondly, that it's pre-filled with formalin. So systems where formalin is sealed within the reservoir at point of manufacture, so there is no opportunity for open air exposure. Third is a range of container sizes matching the container to the specimen, so avoiding unnecessarily large volumes of formalin. Of course, we always recommend on any product looking for a valid CE marking. Single action mechanisms are easier to use and they minimize handling steps, which minimizes opportunity for error or vapor escape. And finally, can it integrate into your clinical workflow? Systems must be compatible with existing laboratory equipment. Now moving on to some conclusionary points. The risk. So healthcare workers in operating theatres, labs, endoscopy units are regularly exposed to formalin formaldehyde. The law requires closed systems wherever technically feasible. PPE and ventilation alone do not satisfy legal obligations, and it's the employers who are responsible. Health, there's the low dose problem where health effects occur at exposure within regulatory limits. And finally, the solutions exist. Closed system containers can reduce exposure by over 90%. This is what we believe you should do after this webinar is an audit, review your current handling practices, identify if open containers are still in use and what workflows you're following, quantify the exposure your staff are actually experiencing. Assess, so look through the 6 criteria we've just shared and please look at our white paper if you need a more detailed overview, and act. You should implement closed system specimen handling. Given all the evidence we now have, the continued reliance on open containers is, to put it plainly, neither legally or ethically defensible. Some final conclusions. Formalin remains indispensable in healthcare. It will not be replaced in the foreseeable future. Routine formalin handling poses well-documented significant risks. Health effects can occur even below regulatory limits. The frameworks are very clear. The legal stance is clear. Closed systems should be in place. Closed system containers reduce formaldehyde exposure without compromising diagnostic quality or workflow. And adoption is not merely advisable. It's the only defensible course of action. Here is another QR code for you to download the white paper. It's free, and please share it with as many people as you can. And also my contact details are on the screen there. So we now have approximately 10 minutes to take questions. And thank you for listening to our presentation. If anyone has any questions. So I have a question here from Nina, which says, we have had trouble finding suitable leak-proof containers for transporting large formalin-fixed samples. The container should have a capacity of 5 to 10 litres and be rectangular. Does anyone have any good suggestions? And as a note, as the EBN, we have to remain product neutral, so I can't give you any suggestions on products to use. But it's an interesting point because obviously in all healthcare settings, you need different containers for different purposes. And all I could suggest is to undertake a risk assessment, to speak to your employer and to try to find a closed system that would suit your workflow, unless Dr. Acran has a different response.
Yeah, my response is similar to yours. I'm unaware of the broader market offer. So it would be more of a design, a specific design to what you need in your healthcare system, and then procure what you need to adapt to your exposure. Yeah.
Thank you. Also, someone's asked about sharing presentation slide decks. This webinar will be recorded and published on YouTube. We'll send you the link afterwards. Please feel free to share it. A question from Emma Stopford. Closed systems may eliminate the risk for theatre staff, but those pots need to be opened when the specimen is being dissected in the lab. What other options are there for histology staff other than PPE and ventilation? Akran?
Um, so let me read the question again. Yes. So there is. So usually when we do the handling of the specimen, there's also always going to be a minimal risk of exposure. Keep in mind that occupational exposure is never zero. It is always going to be some exposure. So you're right. When the closed system may eliminate the risk of people handling, but the idea is to handle it in a way that you get the specimen, put it on the container, and then close it before you expose the formalin per se. So a combination of using a closed system, ventilation, and PPE will, with proper handling of the specimen, will minimize the risk of exposure at maximum. So that's my answer to that. There are some negative pressure also systems that have been discussed, but that's yet to be seen. How effective they are. But point being is that you want to put in place as much as preventive implementations you can, so you minimize the exposure as most as possible with proper handling.
Thank you. The other two questions there are about products again, about are there different specimen pots available in different systems? So again, I would recommend undertaking a risk assessment in your healthcare setting, taking that risk assessment with your employer to then look at available products that are available through your healthcare system. And important to note is that that changes from hospital to hospital, but also country to country. And what's available usually will come through your employer. Um, Unless there's any more questions, I'd ask Akran if you have any concluding points. There's another question from Paula. Given the differences in occupational exposure limits across countries, do you think the European limit for formaldehyde should be revised based on the latest epidemiological evidence? Having looked at this and developed our white paper, I would say the answer is yes. Our slides on low dose exposure were quite clear, and the more evidence that comes out, it becomes much clearer that all exposure should be limited to as close as zero as possible. Exposure limits are useful, but it also then allows employers to operate at those exposure limits, which then there's evidence showing that even exposure below those limits is causing health effects. So I would say yes. Akran?
Yeah, I agree with your assessment. I mean, like I showed in my slide, which we can share, and it's also very well published that a lot of these exposure limits are very lenient. And you also very well spoke about it in your presentation that even that health effects actually unfortunately start being presented in workers even by complying with the most strict exposure limits that we find around the world. So I would say I don't want to speak about the European Union per se specifically, but in general, we want to have a more strict exposure limit so we can minimize the risk factor. So in the case of the European Union, it's a middle ground between moderate and lenient, but there's always the willingness to make this as protective as possible. Yeah.
And I think in the UK, the limit's much higher. I think it's actually the highest limit globally, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Yeah, it's very
so
lenient. Yeah.
the answer for the UK is definitely that it needs to be revised. Hopefully part of our work as the EBN will be to work with the European Union, looking at the exposure limits and sharing the latest evidence to encourage a revision. A question here from Alan Beswick. Could he suggest that in the lab setting where off-gassing is known to occur during regular dissection, then some form of LEV, which would be an enclosed cabinet, is used, would offer engineered protection at source? These are present in many labs anyway. So my understanding is that closed systems have to work within workflows, and if you're in a lab where the biopsy might be being taken, there is no way to use that within a closed system like an isolator or a LEV that's mentioned there. However, if it's just someone dissecting and working with that specimen, then that can happen within a LEV or a closed unit. So it's when it's kind of in practice in a clinical setting, you're taking the biopsy, that you have lots of maybe open pots. But then if you can handle that specimen within an isolated or closed system like a LEV, then you should. Akron?
Yeah, I mean that question answers a little bit of the earlier question that there are some cases where it's very hard to use a point blank closed system, for example, histology labs, right? So, you want to use preventive mechanisms that off gas and then can ventilate and maybe absorb those with negative pressure, those gases being issued by these specimens when we use the formalin. So it's a good suggestion, and I think the message here is to understand exactly what the exposure is, what the workflow is, what the handling is, and then use as much as preventive measures you can to minimize the risk factor. I mean, it's not only heads or tails here. It's a wide range of exposures and cases. Um,
Thank you. A question here for you. I don't know the answer. From Georgios Demarakis is asking about opinions or systems with pre-filled saline solution. Do you suggest with or without saline?
That's a very technical industrial hygiene questions. I'll defer that to the experts. But we can always look into it, look within our network, and then we can answer this offline.
Thank you. And in the chat, I've put my colleague Ella's email address if anyone has any follow-up questions. So with only a minute left of this webinar, I'd like to thank you all for giving us your time today. I'd like to thank our expert speaker, Dr. Acran Selman Navarro. I hope you found this useful, and the part of the purpose of this webinar is for collaboration. We'd love to hear from you to share your experiences and to continue this important work to protect healthcare workers from occupational exposure to formalin and formaldehyde. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. Goodbye.